From HanselMinutes.com, it's Hansel Minutes, a weekly discussion with web developer and technologist Scott Hanselman. This is Lawrence Ryan announcing show number 338, recorded live Thursday, September 20th, 2012. This episode is brought to you by Telerik, offering the best in developer tools and support. Online at telerik.com. And by Franklins.net, training developers to work smarter. And now offering Gesture Pack, a powerful gesture recording and recognition system for Microsoft Connect for Windows developers. Details at gesturepak.com. In this episode, Scott talks with Anthony van der Hoorn and Nik Molnar about the open source project Glimpse.
Hi, this is Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes, and today the Glimpse guys are back. Anthony van der Hoorn calling in from Australia, and Nik Molnar from New York. Thanks, guys, for coming on the show and updating us on what's going on with Glimpse.
No problem, Scott. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So big stuff since I saw you last. I feel like I've kind of been a watcher or a part of, in some small way, this whole experience from the moment that I saw you guys at Mix. I want to say it was Mix 2011 at the Open Source Fest. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. It was a pretty great experience, and it's still very surreal in my mind, that whole experience that we had. But yeah, it was crazy. Basically, we were at this open source festival. I think it was John Papa's open source festival. Mm-hmm.
And basically people were showing their open source projects, and somebody grabbed me, I think it was Phil Hack, and said, "You've got to see this." And that happens a lot, but Phil grabbing me. And and he says, "Come look at this." And he, within about 5 minutes, I was like, "Oh my goodness, this is going to be awesome." And then Glimpse was born, right? Glimpse, it's a client-side open source tool. It looks like Firebug, and if you looked at it just briefly, you might say, "Oh, this is just a plugin. It's just Firebug." But then you start realizing that this is a Firebug for the server, and it's implemented entirely in JavaScript. It's an amazing tool, and I love using it. Nik, how do you describe it? What's your elevator speech for Glimpse?
We like to give it is Firebug for the server. One of the things that we've been talking a little bit more about is it's kind of like the dashboard in your car. It's got all the gauges and dials and information that you really need to take the journey. And it's part of a trifecta of web development debugging tools, where you have your F12 tools like Firebug or the IE tools. You have Fiddler that's kind of in the middle and sits on the wire. And then you have Glimpse, which sits on the server. And all three of those are very important points of view when you're doing your work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that's amazing about Glimpse that I've enjoyed was, one, that you guys were very early to adopt NuGet as a way to get it installed. I always use Glimpse, Elma, and Mini Profiler as kind of like the triumvirate of awesome open source debugging tools. And Elma was one of the first from, now almost 10 years. But the thing about Elma was that it required someone to go and get a zip file and download it and unzip it and unblock it and put it in web config and do all this work. NuGet solved that, and Glimpse, I would guess probably Glimpse would be pretty hard to set up if it wasn't for NuGet. And you guys went right for it. So you can just go file a new project, install package Glimpse, and boom, you're ready to go.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Certainly for us, NuGet's been a great release vehicle for getting our packages out there. It's got updates built into it. Takes care of anything we need in the web config. All of that NuGet provides us, and we've been very, very, very happy with it.
Now, recently, just let me see here, about a week and a half ago, there was a blog post up on the Redgate blog that said that you guys have quit your jobs and you are now working for Redgate. Are you employees of Redgate?
Technically, yes. So at the moment, they're paying our wages and allowing us to, which allows us to quit our job and to be able to do Glimpse full time.
And quit your job. So when you say technically yes, I mean you are an employee. Like you'll have healthcare and you'll have what? You're not a consultant.
No.
Okay.
So at the moment, strictly speaking, we're contractors because we're still figuring out some of the final details because it turns out trying to get international contracts signed and all that sort of stuff is a time-consuming process. But yeah, ultimately, all that stuff will be taken care of.
Now, I remember when having kind of candid conversations with you guys over dinner a couple of times that trying to figure out how to make this work with your existing jobs was a problem. I mean, it was almost like, you had this open source thing, you were doing it on the side, and suddenly it became popular, and it's like, well, how do we do this, right? While finding balance, right? Do we quit? Do we try to sell it? Do we try to productize it? I mean, how many different things did you think about, Nick, to make Glimpse more than a hobby?
Oh, we thought about a lot of different things. We thought about selling Glimpse or selling updates to Glimpse or selling various plugins that we could create. But I think you hit the nail on the head. We kind of went from 0 to 60 with Glimpse. We released it at Open Source Fest, and within a couple of weeks, we had 20,000 users. And supporting them and keeping up with bugs and all that kind of stuff there was a lot of psychic weight to having a successful open source project. So we had looked around to see if anybody was interested in letting us work on this full time, and everything had kind of quieted down. To be honest with you, I think Anthony and I were content that this was always going to be a hobby for us, and we had learned, to not take ourselves so seriously. When out of the blue, Redgate had contacted us and said, "Hey, listen, we really, really love Glimpse, and we'd like to see more happening with it. What can we do?" And that started that communication channel.
There's been some backlash on comments on both on your blog and on the Redgate blog, and a number of people are saying, "Hey, this is great, good for you." Other folks are saying, "Wow, Nick and Anthony just got a big old pile of money." Presumably there was doubloons and big huge piles of pirate booty shipped into your homes. Was this a situation where it's just like, hey, we want to go work on full time and we're going to become I wouldn't say kept, but how you have a benefactor, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. You have a benefactor in Redgate. I mean, did they buy you or buy you out? Did they buy the intellectual property?
Yeah, so this is the interesting thing. The best way I'd put how this works is that Redgate is supporting us. So in terms of open source stuff, Nick and I still control the licensing. So, even if they wanted to, close the licensing off and make it impossible for people to use, they couldn't do that because that's something Nick and I still use. Nick and I still control, for GitHub, who has contributor access, and they can't remove me and Nick and all that sort of stuff. So Nick and I are still, holding the keys to the castle, as it were. And so, yeah, I guess you could look at the arrangement as being a bit of a benefactor. But, I choose to see it as that they support us in trying to help the community. And part of that support is, we have a designer working with us at the moment to try and help, redo our website and come up with a better UI and all this sort of stuff, and other resources like testing and whatever else. So yeah, that's the sort of support that we're getting from them.
Mm-hmm. When Lutz Roeder, who I consider a friend, sold Reflector to Redgate, he was in a similar situation where he was working at Microsoft, had this really popular thing on the side, couldn't figure out a way to monetize it. Gave it over to Redgate. Redgate says, hooray, we'll make this thing free. And then, a year later kind of gets nailed because they decide to start charging, and now it's popping up registration. And frankly, I don't even use Reflector anymore just because it put a bad taste in everyone's mouth. And so everyone's kind of picking on you, and they're saying that this is where open source goes to die. When you approached Redgate or they approached you, was that your kind of knee-jerk reaction? Was like, oh no, not again? And how did you get past that?
Of course, so Redgate approached us, and when they did, we said, "Oh, hey, you're the Reflector people."
Hey, how's it going? Yeah,
there was a lot of trepidation. It's like going on a blind date with somebody for the first time. You don't really know what they're going to look like until you sit down in a room with them and have a meal. And that's exactly what we did. Anthony and I went out to England, and we sat with them for a few days, and we were real honest with them about how we were worried. Some of the history of what's happened to them. And kind of frankly, they've been beaten up by the community, and they have a black eye. Mm-hmm. And, I have to say that we came away really impressed with how much they've kind of looked back at what they did and the lessons that they've learned. And they understand that that was not how they want to be dealing with the community, and that they're trying to learn from those lessons and move forward. And I think Glimpse is as much about a technology as it is about the community for Redgate. And we have, obviously we're biased, but we've had a lot of conversations with Redgate, and we really do believe that they're trying to do what's best and trying to move on from past mistakes at this point.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you kind of set this thing up where there's a ripcord. I mean, in the sense of, you really do own the IP. They are your benefactor. They didn't buy you. This isn't like a Glimpse buyout kind of a thing. They're supporting 2 full-time guys and giving you designers and stuff to make something better for the community. But, is this an indefinite thing? Would they call you one day and say, "Hey, we need you to work on Super Widget 2.0. Can you stop working on Glimpse for a while?" Or
Yeah, so at the moment, it's an indefinite thing. And I guess what you're describing with the ripcord could be accurate. I really hope it never comes to that. But in theory, discussions we've had is, look, if someone does something evil or something like that, we can walk away from it, and do what's right for the community. And we've even had discussions that, and this doesn't make sense now, but in the future, we'd love to see Glimpse go the way of like jQuery and, where there's a board of people who are looking after the future of where Glimpse is going. And, Nick and I may be on that, or we may not be. Someone from Redgate may be on that, but may not be. But the community is deciding the future. And right now we discussed, does that make sense? That's a level of conversation we've been having. And it's kind of like, well, there's not quite enough, the same volume of people using Glimpse at the moment as there is jQuery.
Of course.
But that's where we want the future to go. So yeah, I think it's really interesting what's going to happen. And, I think everyone's committed to the open source nature of this. And I think the other thing that we all discovered in this process was there's a difference between something being closed source and free and something being open source and free. And, when looking at all of this, those nuances start coming out. And, to the outside person, free is free. But, to us, developing open source software, it's rather important.
That's cool. It's comforting to know that. I mean, I was a little kind of worried. I mean, I know that they're not evil, but like you said, they have a black eye. And I think that's the thing. So this is an opportunity for them to fix that, which is really cool. So it sounds like we are not going to see banner ads in Glimpse, and we are not going to see pop-ups that require email addresses that get harvested in Glimpse.
No. Yeah. That was something we were very concerned about as well. And it's amazing how much back and forth we did on some of this in a good way, testing boundaries and saying, well, what if this happened and what if that happened? And at the end of the day, it was like, well, if we remain control of the licensing and we retain control of who has commit access, if someone even tried to do that, whether it's Redgate or someone from the community, it's like, well, we pull your access and we undo what you did. And let's say Nick and I went to the dark side. We've already said to all of our major contributors, look, we charge you with, if something bad happens or there's something happening that you don't like, fork it, please take it in the right direction for the community.
That is different than Reflector. I mean, in the Reflector situation, there was no opportunity for someone to take the code and quote unquote rescue it.
Yes. And so, that's where we see a big difference in what's going on and a huge opportunity for the community. And I think this is kind of a first as far as I can see for the .NET community. And part of what makes me really excited is that you can have a passion project that is open source. And, one day, it could lead to something. And back when during Open Source Fest, that was never a consideration, but it's actually starting to happen.
But not every open source project is big enough or interesting enough or compelling enough for someone to say, I'll be your benefactor, much less, two benefactors. What's in it for them other than rebuilding goodwill?
Well, I mean, they're not going to disillusion anybody, and they've been very honest about this, and it was part of the Redgate blog post on their blog. Because one of the great things about Glimpse is from day one, we've always had an extensibility model. The ability to add tabs via NuGet has always been there. And so, they see a future in which they could potentially take some of their existing technologies and start to build pay-for plugins on top of Glimpse. So imagine something like the power of Ant's performance profiler, which gets way deeper into .NET than we do, or we can. Imagine that technology surfacing itself in Glimpse for every request, or things like that. I mean, your mind can kind of run wild.
No, that totally makes sense. Actually, that reminds me of image resizer guy. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Image resizer.net is this amazing tool that lets you resize images correctly. But what he does is he gives you the free open source version, and then if you want like it to work in Azure, it's like $99 or something.
Mm-hmm.
So that's actually good. So that means that there is a truly full open source version of Glimpse. Well, I would say version. The Glimpse is, period, full stop, open source and free.
Yeah.
And then if you go and buy Redgate products and are also using Glimpse, then Glimpse lights up with profiler stuff or Reflector stuff or, whatever they feel like doing. But it's all done via plugins.
Yeah. You got it.
Now, okay.
And the great thing is it's not just Redgate limited to that surface area either. Mm-hmm. So if some other company wanted to create their great technology and put it on top of the Glimpse platform and deliver it just via that mechanism, it's available for them to do it as well.
Okay, cool. So let's talk tech then, because I know that a lot of work has been put into extensibility specifically, and you've got Glimpse 1.0 CTP. Does that mean it's like a beta of 1.0?
Yeah, it is like a beta. We borrowed the Microsoft terminology there, so it's a community technology preview. No problem. Hey, you probably invented that term.
I would like to know when Glimpse 1.0 CTP 1 September refresh comes out, because that's the one to wait for.
Well, we're working on Magic Unicorns right now, so when that's done.
Okay.
So this release is focused primarily at the 30 or so people who have built plugins on top of Glimpse already, the Glimpse that's live, which is version 0.87, because we've got a lot of feedback from the community and from Microsoft directly that they would like to see support for things like self-hosted web API or for web frameworks that run on a stack like Owen. Mm-hmm. And so what we've done is we've completely re-architected Glimpse to no longer have a dependency on system.web and thus no longer have a dependency on IIS. Because of that, there have been some interface changes, which means that plugin authors, to support Glimpse 1.0 moving forward, they're going to have to make some slight changes to their plugins. So the CTP release is not really aimed at end users. It's aimed at authors who are interested in building on top of the platform so they can get their hands on the interfaces, provide us feedback, and have time to do the port before we make a final release.
Okay. So things that I would think that I would want in Glimpse would be like Page Inspector, which I think is really cool on the Microsoft side. Have you talked to those guys at all?
Yeah, we have actually talked to those guys, and they're actually wanting to extend the provider model that they have there to surface the cool data that they're doing a lot of hard work to actually gather. And it would mean that instead of just being restricted to Page Inspector inside of Visual Studio, you could use any browser on your development machine to get access to that data. And, potentially, depending on what the implementation is like, any server. So you could be running in your UAT environment and hover your mouse around the screen and actually see what partial renders, rendered what content. And so that's pretty cool.
You said a minute ago, I think it was Nick, about Owen, and people who are listening may not know what that means. OWIN, Open Web Interface for .NET. You talk a little bit about that and why people kind of on the cutting edge are excited about it?
Sure. What Owen does is it's very similar to kind of Rack on the Ruby side. From my understanding, I'm not an expert in it by any means, but essentially it is yet another layer of indirection in between the web development framework that you choose to use, whether that be something like MVC or Web Forms or, Castle Mono or whatever it is, and the underlying host. So that host might be IIS, or it might be something a little bit lower level, like a service that you might write yourself, particularly useful in RESTful type scenarios, or there's a bunch of open source implementations being written. But what that allows you to do is kind of own a little bit more of the stack and make the stack more portable, as long as we're talking about IL and web. Everything that writes to Owen is kind of even across the board.
Okay, so let me see if I got this right, because I want to see if I paraphrase and you tell me if I get it correctly. So things like WCF in the past had a thing called self-hosting, where you could, or service activator, where you could have an HTTP service or a TCP service fired up in a console app or in a Windows service, and you would bypass IIS entirely. Because right now, ASP.NET and IIS kind of are married. They're kind of Siamese. I wouldn't say married. They're more Siamese twins with a little fabric of attachment there. And Owen, you described it as yet another layer of indirection, but it probably could also be described as a way to decouple something like ASP.NET from any web server. So then theoretically, I could fire up ASP.NET in a console app or in a service or on Apache even, I suppose. Is that a fair characterization?
Exactly. That's my understanding. And what's really interesting about that is, because there's a common way to write down to kind of the networking stack and back up to the web app, there's a concept called middleware that lives in Owen, where something like Glimpse could plug in and work almost universally across web development frameworks and web servers, or your own server, as you said, in a console application. And that's pretty exciting to us. In a future where Owen is utilized more often, we could see Glimpse kind of fitting in there really nicely.
Okay, cool. And then Web API is out now, and it's kind of part of the larger one ASP.NET. Are you guys on board with that whole concept?
Yeah, so we've actually had discussions with Web API guys, and we pretty much know where we need to hook in, and it's just a matter of time, trying to find the time to do that. Back when we released it Open Source Fest, you would have thought it was a pretty safe assumption to take dependencies on system.web and IIS. But, and a lot of that drove the architecture. And with, web APIs coming out and saying, hey, look, we want to run self-hosted as well. It was like, oh no, what did we do? And, a lot of people question the sanity of having to go back and do a re-architecting or something like that. But for us, we felt that OWIN was really important. Self-hosted web APIs and stuff like that, are going to be a big part of our future, and hence the work we needed to do. So now that we've almost finished this CTP work that we've been doing, either Nick or I or someone from the community or whatever else can now develop the web API plugins and know, hey, look, the exact same work that I do is going to work whether you're hosting in IIS or self-hosted, which was really important.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite things on Windows is the mini profiler that Sam Saffron and the guys at Stack Overflow did. I'm a huge fan of that, and it's got plugins for Entity Framework and Link to SQL and WCF most recently. But it's not something that he's working on full time. He's updating it here and there, and he's put some new .NET features in about 3 months ago. But most recently, he's been adding in Ruby. So I got two questions. One, what is your thinking about a live production time profiler like Mini Profiler that would talk to Entity Framework or any kind of SQL backend? That's question one. And noticing here that Sam has checked in Ruby support for Mini Profiler 2 days ago. How do you see Glimpse dovetailing with him and also with Ruby in general? Okay,
so we'll start with one, because that usually comes before two. So we think that production type support or profiling a la Mini Profiler is a very common usage scenario, and one that we actually support doing. Of course, we've had a beta tag on Glimpse since day one. That will be coming off very soon, and then we'll be looking to add more production support. Of course, as soon as you start profiling something, you begin to add overhead into your requests. So that's something that we'll caution developers to be careful about. But depending on the scenario, 1 or 2 milliseconds added onto a request is probably not that big of a deal. And that's the kind of order of magnitude of delay that we're talking about by adding in simple profiling. So I think that kind of covers off number one there. And then for number two, it's interesting that you mentioned Ruby support. One of the things that Anthony and I have always worked on from day one is a really clean separation between the client and the server. Everybody laughs because Glimpse looks so much like Firebug. Originally, Glimpse was supposed to be a Firefox extension and a Chrome extension and an IE extension. And it was really out of sheer laziness because none of us wanted to learn how to do that, develop those development models, that we decided to go with JavaScript, and it worked everywhere and it worked great. And we were like, hey, this is better. But because we always knew we were going to have separate clients, the server and the client are very decoupled from each other. So that means that now we kind of have a universal client. We need to start looking at other servers. And so if you actually look at our GitHub page, we have people who have already donated or contributed to PHP implementations of Glimpse. Somebody is working on a Rack version, and somebody is also working on the equivalent of Rack in the Python world. So we're looking at kind of branching out into those other areas. Anthony and I are not experts in any of those other technologies, although we may have to become them as we move forward. But a world where Glimpse is kind of universal across web development is something that we would love to see happen. We just need to get all the right pieces in place.
All right, that's cool. Do you think that you're going to always prefer .NET, or are you guys going to work completely independent? Like, are you going to give, if let's say this blows up in the PHP world or whatever, are you going to respect those guys the same?
Yeah, I think at the moment the client of Glimpse is in the .NET client, but we've talked about potentially pulling it into its own repository and moving on from there. And that means that from a Git point of view, Git has this concept of like sub-repositories, which in like a Visual Studio TFS world would mean that it's almost like you can have a TFS project referencing another TFS project, and the code to be included. And so for our client, that makes a lot of sense. And because it means that any other server-side framework can just reference this sub-repository, and they'll get the latest code as they go along. And, in terms of will one have favoritism over the other, Nick and I, are .NET guys through and through. As he said, we're probably starting to get our hands dirty in some of the other worlds. But, it's something that, our passions are in at the moment. And, we're certainly not going to let it go by the wayside. There's too many interesting things happening in this space not to pay attention to .NET. For instance, a Jabber plugin, has always made my mind tick. How cool would it be to actually show what's actually happening between the connection to the from the client to the server, and the various groups that are around, and all sorts of different things. So a lot of really interesting stuff's happening in this space here and now.
Okay, last question. Are there any technical things that you're bumping up against, or you think that just will never be solvable? Is there something that you really wish you could have done, and it's just not going to happen?
We have actually had really good access into the ASP.NET team to get help with all kinds of various things. We run into a bit of problems with writing to the response stream, particularly because the filters mechanism built into ASP.NET feels a little, it's kind of a king of the hill, right? Like one guy will run to the top and knock the other guy off if they're not playing nicely. And so we run into problems where we're mixing with other open source or closed source extensions to ASP.NET, and that will kind of mess things up, and we're constantly kind of dancing around that. We're also trying to get deeper and deeper into the view engines, and so that's kind of a little bit of a slow and arduous process, but we've been working with some of the guys on those teams to see what access we can and can't get.
Has the open sourcing of the web stack helped at all? I mean, it's good that you keep saying we talked to those guys and we're able to get a hold of these guys and gals. But have you ever had to just not even call anybody because all the source is just out there?
Oh, all the time. And that's always been true even before the big open source announcement, because primarily our focus has been on MVC. We do support web forms, But to be honest with you, we could do a much better job there, and that's something that we're looking to improve. But MVC has been open source since day one, for at least since Glimpse has been around. So we've always kind of had access to the source code. So I think that it's great that development has happened, and I think that great things are happening in the .NET community for open source at Microsoft, at Redgate. I want to see it happening at other places as well. But that didn't really change us because of our focus.
Okay. One thing that does come to mind, however, on that front is the open sourcing of MVC, for instance, means that if there is somewhere in the pipeline that we'd like to be able to hook in, if we can have a discussion with the guys and say, hey, look, this is our thoughts around what we could do differently to be able to hook in more easily for us or Mini Profile or whoever else. And they go, yeah, that sounds like a cool idea. We can actually do that development and, submit the code for that. And that may not be a Microsoft priority, but it's a priority for us. And as long as everyone's on the same page, it's code that we can commit. So, that does make me really excited about what's happened at the moment.
All right. Very cool. So people can still go and get Glimpse and hear about Glimpse at getglimpse.com. And you've got NuGet packages, and you've got great documentation, and you've got an active Google Groups. Since you've got benefactors, I don't suppose you have a tip jar, so we really don't need to help you there anymore, do we?
No, you don't. Well, we're doing all right.
All right, that's great. Well, congratulations, guys, and thanks for letting me know what was going on. I was a little worried about you there for a minute.
Thanks for having us on, Scott.
Thank you for caring, Scott.
This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.